Hello, folks. I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this is another edition of Jeff Nyquist on the Air broadcasts. And with me is Clare Lopez. She's the Vice President of the Center for Security Policy for Analysis and Research. Clare, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jeff. Good to be with you again. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great. And today we're having this disturbing news out of London about some kind of terrorist attack. Do you have any details?
Well, the latest that I've been watching live stream over Fox News is that sometime this evening, London time, that is, we are at Saturday, June the 3rd, 2017, and evening London time, a vehicle once again was involved reportedly in mowing down pedestrians on the London Bridge. There were eyewitness accounts of bodies lying motionless on the ground. Also reports of gunshots, perhaps from security services who flooded the zone. And there are now many armed with full gear police forces and many emergency vehicles at the site in downtown London. But the situation is ongoing, and the news keeps coming in.
Now, London is a city that has a large Islamic population, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And this is one of the problems throughout Europe, is that in France, in Britain, in Germany, in Scandinavia, we've got larger and larger Muslim populations. How somebody was telling me the other day that at a certain age in the schools, the majority of the children are Muslim children. Is that true in some of these European countries?
Apparently so. The demographics for a number of places, cities in particular, like London, Amsterdam in the Netherlands, Rotterdam, Antwerp, and maybe even Paris, I've heard as well. The most popular name for baby boys 2016, 2017 is Muhammad, or variations on Muhammad like Ahmed and so forth. And there is a dearth of population growth among native French, British, Belgians, Dutch, while the immigrant populations of Muslims that they have permitted in by the thousands and tens of thousands typically are having many more children per family, per woman, than their host country citizens are.
So that 20 years from now, we are looking at a point at which major European countries, the military age population may be majority Muslim.
Yes, yes, that is true. And not just there, but think about a place like Russia as well. The same demographic story is playing out in Russia. Remember what Bernard Lewis said, the eminent Middle East scholar, Bernard Lewis. At one point some years ago, he said that by the end of this century, that is the 21st century, Europe will be not Muslim, but it will be Islamic. And the difference is that while the Muslim population, yes, it's growing rapidly and overtaking other populations in many places, what he meant by that was that their numbers, even if they're not in the absolute majority, would be so large, relevant to the host country population, that they would begin to demand and enforce Islamic law, Sharia, because that's the objective. It's not necessarily immediately to convert everybody to Islam, but rather to subjugate everyone to Islamic law. And you'd be surprised at what levels, percentage of the population, 5–6%, at which those demands are now so overwhelming that places are beginning to capitulate.
I mean, in 60 years, and probably sooner, in 50 years, we're likely looking at a situation where these democratically organized European countries will probably have majorities voting for Muslim candidates for office, who can then be dictating the laws or changing the laws of the various countries in Europe.
Well, I mean, at the very least, necessity to get votes, to be elected to anything, city council, mayor, or what have you, means that politicians running for those positions will have to seek Muslim votes in order to be elected, and that's the slippery slope to Sharia.
Sharia. Now, Sharia is Islamic law. As I understand it, the Muslims don't really believe in constitutional government, but that Islam is simultaneously not just a religious system, but a political system as well. Is that correct?
Exactly right. Yes.
And so Sharia, give us an idea, what kind of things are mandated by Sharia?
Well, to begin with, Sharia mandates inequality. Inequality first between Muslims and non-Muslims, but secondly between men and women, whether Muslim or not, and then also among other populations. For example, no non-Muslim, no adherent of any other faith, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, or anything, under Islamic law will ever be equal under the law. Let's take the example of women, just for starters. The Quran itself is the primary source of Islamic law, and so anything in there that Muslims believe is given to Muslims directly, word for word, literally from Allah Himself. That's why it's immutable. That's why it can't be changed. And in the Quran, it says that men may have 4 wives. That men should beat their wives if they fear disobedience from them, that a woman's word in an Islamic court of law is worth 1/2 that of men, that a girl or woman would inherit 1/2 that of what a male would, and on and on.
Wow. And now, does the Sharia dictate who is ultimately in charge of a state under Islam?
Well, it's not so much the who as the what, I guess. And certainly Muhammad is believed by Muslims to have been the founder and the first leader of Islam. And then after him followed on the Sunni side a whole series of caliphs, rulers. And then the split with Shia Islam meant that on the other side, the Shiite side, there was a succession of imams. And so those became the leaders of Islamic communities following what we are told is the death of Muhammad in the year 632. But more to the point, because leadership of Muslim countries, societies, communities, so often has been contested, and violently, as we see today going on in the Middle East and elsewhere. But the important thing, as I said, not the who, but the what, and the what is Sharia. A Muslim community, a Muslim society, always must fight jihad, and jihad under Islamic law is defined as warfare against non-Muslims. Jihad must be fought to impose and enforce Sharia over not just Muslim societies and communities, but the entire world. And that's why what we're seeing in London today is another reminder.
Sorry about that. I didn't turn my phone off. Sorry, go ahead.
Not to worry. So what we are seeing today in London take place, and many other places, of course, it reminds us that jihad continues, that we are in a period, according to an Al-Qaeda timeline that was published in 2005, for goodness sakes, a period of total confrontation. Jihad must be fought. Every single Muslim who is a faithful Muslim is obligated to fight jihad until Islamic law is enforced and imposed on everyone, the entire world, Muslim or non-Muslim.
That is a total vision. I'm not sure why I'm getting an echo here. I don't know why it does these changes. Anyway, I've got the book that's put out by the Center for Security Policy. It is Sharia, the Threat to America. And there's a passage that really fascinated me in this book called Blasphemy. And I'm just going to read the first paragraph and have you comment on this. It says, for non-believers, the corollary to the Islamic rule against disclosing anything disadvantageous to Islam is Sharia's prohibition against blasphemy. This requires that infidels, that's non-believers, refrain from engaging in discussions about Islam that extend beyond what is permitted of them or would give offense to Muslims. That sounds like no freedom of speech.
Well, precisely. We Americans are among the luckiest people on the face of the earth to have our Constitution and our First Amendment that guarantees, among other things, the right to free speech. Also the right to believe as our conscience dictates, the right to freedom of religion. Those things are entirely absent under Islamic law. And again, we were talking about this book a little while ago too. This is called The Reliance of the Traveler, or Umdat al-Salik in the Arabic. And it's a book of law, comes from the Shafi school on the Sunni side of Islam. But its major points, its major legal principles are shared across all the schools on the Sunni side as well, as mostly on the Shiite side as well. So things like blasphemy and slander, which do not mean the same thing under Islamic law as they do, let's say, in US law or other Western law. Slander, of course, under Islamic law means, as you were alluding to in that quote from our book there, of which I was privileged to be the editor as well as co-author, published in 2010 by the Center for Security Policy, references slander in Sharia, which is anything that would offend a Muslim. You see, completely subjective and based on what a Muslim would decide is offensive or not. This has real world implications, real world ramifications in the United States in particular, of course, we're concerned with. And so, for example, in the years since 9/11, the attacks in the United States of 9/11, we have had literally members and affiliates, associates of the Muslim Brotherhood, a jihadist organization, working as advisors to the US government to remove from training and official documents too, and official discourse, anything that they, the jihadi Muslim brothers in America, found offensive, in keeping with Sharia, with Islamic law. And so these are the consequences when you don't understand what their objective is. It's not to kill everybody or make a huge pile of skulls like Genghis Khan, although they're happy to do that too. But the real objective is to subordinate us all to Islamic law. And when they enforce the law on blasphemy and on slander, this is what they're accomplishing.
So would you characterize the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration as appeasers of the Muslim Brotherhood in this agenda?
Unfortunately, yes, I would have to say so. I don't think in any way that is what President George W. Bush intended or thought that he was doing, but he was surrounded in his administration by members of and associates of the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, so was President Obama, who I think had a much clearer vision of who and what the Muslim Brotherhood is and what Islamic law is. But under both of those presidencies, spanning now, we're coming on, 2017, so it's, we're coming up on 17 years, almost 18 years from I'm sorry, 16, I can't do my math, from the attacks. And no meaningful steps have actually been taken at the governmental level, US government level, to identify clearly the enemy, which is forces of Islamic jihad and Sharia, and then to go after that enemy, both domestically and abroad, despite the oath of office of anyone who takes it to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They haven't done it.
So our relationships with countries like Saudi Arabia, being that Saudi Arabia is where Mecca is, that was the city, Mecca and Medina were the cities where sort of Muhammad started the religion, right?
It is said so in the Islamic canon, yes.
Yeah, and so these are the people. The Saudis are people of Islam. Was it the Bush's relationship with the Saudis that made George W. Bush vulnerable to being drawn into this Islam as a religion of peace? And how are we to understand that?
Perhaps in part, yes. I think it's more than that. Certainly the Bush family, going back to Bush the elder, 41, as they call him, the 41st president, George Herbert Walker Bush, and then, of course, George Walker Bush, 43, as they call him, had relationships with the Saudis, and in particular, President G.W. Bush, after 9/11, before and after the attacks of 9/11, a very close relationship with the Saudi ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar, of the royal family, who, as it turns out, now that we've seen the released declassified 28 pages of the document, which is taken from the congressional post 9/11 report, showing his complicity and the complicity of the Saudis in the attacks of 9/11. So it's partly that. And remember, I mean, until the recent technological revolution in this country, which brought us fracking and the ability to extract shale oil more feasibly, the United States, as well as many of our allies who remain, but we were heavily dependent on Middle East oil and in particular Saudi oil. That's not the case anymore, but it was then. So there's that. But beyond that, because of the failure of successive presidents, and honestly, I'd have to go back to Dwight D. Eisenhower, if you can imagine this, did not understand who and what the Muslim Brotherhood was, which began in Egypt in 1928 and jumped the pond, if you will, after World War II over here, because none of the presidents after that really knew and understood what they were and the threat that they posed. The Brotherhood was allowed to penetrate deeply into every sector of American society, but especially, of course, yes, top levels of national security in the U.S. government.
Now, President Trump has just gone over to Saudi Arabia and has made some agreements with them, and there's this thing where Iran and Saudi Arabia are kind of enemies, staring at each other across the Gulf. One represents Sunni Islam, you described before. The other represents Shia Islam. Is it a smart policy, it seems, to sell weapons to one side or the other? And are we is it necessary for us to be allies with Saudi Arabia, and is that compromising us further?
I know the questions are really serious ones, and yeah, I mean, the concern is definitely there. Let's make no mistake, the Saudis are not our friends. Now, can and possibly may they be pragmatic realpolitik partners of a sort in a situation where the Shiite side of this equation, the Iranians, are on the brink of deploying deliverable nuclear weapons with ballistic missiles that can reach the continental United States, either from Iran's own territory itself, or much easier, from some kind of a ship or fishing boat or something, 12 miles off the continental shelf, or the territorial waters, I should say, of the United States, lofting. All they need is one single nuclear weapon that explodes in the high atmosphere and rains down gamma rays against our totally unprotected civilian electric grid and fries it, taking down the grid and sending us all back to the 18th century Little House on the Prairie days, except that most of us now live in urban and suburban areas totally dependent on electricity. So that threat, and of course the the alliance, the very close, I call it a joint venture, working arrangement between Iran and North Korea on nuclear weapons and the ballistic missiles to deliver them, is an immediate and a critical threat to the survival of the existence not only of their arch enemies like Saudi Arabia or Israel in the Middle East region, but us too. And then you weigh that against the longer term and still very serious and perhaps even ultimately existential threat of the civilizational jihad that the Saudis have perpetrated against us, meaning the infiltration of our society, mosque building, the financing of imams and madrasas, Islamic schools and textbooks and all the rest of it, information operations by the Muslim Brotherhood against our civic leaders, our faith leaders, our law enforcement, and on and on. Weigh those, and are we in a kind of situation like we faced during World War II, when, yes, Winston Churchill and FDR, President Roosevelt, we did ally ourselves with Stalin in order to defeat the then immediately an existential threat of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, only to face the other threat practically immediately as World War II ended. We're not in a good place. I mean, either way, but I will come down in balance on President Trump's visit to the Middle East and his speech, especially in Riyadh, as throwing down the gauntlet in a way that I think no president before him has ever done to what I think of as the collected mob bosses of the Sunni world, because that's who was in that audience in Riyadh. Essentially, most of the members of the OIC, that's Organization of Islamic Cooperation, there were 57 altogether. There were 50-something there in Riyadh, of course, minus the Shiites. That's who he was speaking to. And what he said to them, no American president has ever said before. So it's a kind of a choice faced with an immediate, critical, existential threat and a longer-term one.
What did the president say? Could you kind of give us an overview of what he actually said that was so unique?
Well, the first part of the speech was full of, you know, the usual sort of diplomatic niceties and nods in the direction of his host. His host, of course, was King Salman of Saudi Arabia. Nods in the direction of some of the other Sunni mob bosses. By the way, I'm thinking of Trump in this situation. I don't know if he'd care for this or not, but the way I thought of him was as the capo de tutti capi, who himself has built casinos and other things in places like New Jersey and New York. So the first part of the speech, you could almost hear kind of the cut and paste from some of his advisors, close advisors, national security level advisors around him. But then there came a point in the speech when he moved on. He turned to other subjects, and he began talking about a battle, he said, between criminals who seek to obliterate human life and us, the civilized world. A battle between good and evil, he said. He referenced Islam without saying its name, but he called it a wicked ideology. Everybody knew what he meant. He didn't have to say Islam. He said a wicked ideology. And then after that, he kind of dropped the hammer down. And he said, the nations of the Middle East must not wait, cannot wait for American power to crush the enemy for them, the enemy. The nations of the Middle East will have to decide what kind of future they want for themselves, for their countries, and for their children. I'm looking at the speech. I'm taking a look at it here in front of me now. I'm quoting from it.
Interesting.
And so then he wasn't done yet. Then he said, it is a choice between two futures, and it is a choice America, emphasis, cannot make for you. A better future is only possible if your nations Drive out the terrorists and the extremists. Drive them out, he said, measured words in that cadence. Now, yes, he called them extremists, and we know there's no such thing as extremists, but that was a cut and paste from the National Security Advisors again. But this phrase that he then used again and again, drive them out. As good friend of ours, Phil Haney, who's a wonderful scholar of Islam and himself a veteran of the Department of Homeland Security, which of course treated him very badly, and he became a whistleblower because of it. But Phil reminded us that this phraseology, drive them out, comes, and I don't know if Trump knew this or not, but it comes directly out of the Quran. In the original Arabic, that verb is used over and over and over again in the Quran to talk about driving out the enemies of Islam. Now, I really don't know if Trump knew this or not, but he then went on to this section of the speech where he repeats the phrase, drive them out. And the first one that he said was, drive them out of your places of worship. Whoa, nobody's ever said that before, because it means, Trump is saying, I know where this stuff comes from. It comes out of your places of worship. That means mosques and Islamic centers. They knew what he meant. Drive them out of your communities, drive them out of your holy land, drive them out of this earth. So that was, I think, the most significant part of the speech, those bits right there. And I think he really threw down a gauntlet of challenge to those Sunni mob bosses. And he's saying, look, we can work together, and this is in our America First, our interest too, to stop Iran from deploying nuclear weapons. So we've got that going on together for us, but you've got to do some things too. Where this is not going to be a one-sided deal. Trump doesn't make one-sided deals. This is some quid pro quo being demanded of them here today at that speech. And, you know, you can either do that, or we can let the Iranians have you for breakfast. And I think they got the message. I really do. Now, we'll see. I mean, we will totally see what comes out of this. Proof's in the pudding, and we haven't seen any pudding yet. Both sides have to keep at it, and the Trump administration has to keep the pressure on the Saudis in particular, and I would also name the United Arab Emirates as another partner, conditional partner for this effort. If the pressure is kept on them by the Trump administration, and don't forget Israel is part of this mix too, then let's see what happens.
Interesting. Is there a possibility that the Sunnis and the Shias could unite against us in the future?
Well, certainly there's that possibility, and they of course have in the past. I mean, we know certainly from the 9/11 Commission report, and then of course the Havlish case, the 9/11 legal case for which I was an expert witness. Go to www.iran911case.com if you'd like to look at that. Iran, Hezbollah, its Shiite terror proxy in Lebanon and globally, and Al-Qaeda did come together in an operational alliance in 1990 in Khartoum, and that alliance continues to this day. And the Saudis too were involved, as we've just said, in the attacks of 9/11. So it's happened before. Sure, it could happen again, because Muslims, and here we come back to Islamic doctrine, divide the world into two parts. There is the part called the Dar al-Islam, which means house of Islam, and then there's the Dar al-Harb, and Dar al-Harb means house of war. In other words, that place that needs to be conquered by jihad. And at that level, the macro level of things, yes, Sunni and Shia absolutely can and will and do unite together against the non-Muslim. But it can happen simultaneously that at other levels, like in the Middle East we're seeing right now, they're happily tearing one another to shreds. Both things can happen at the same time, and both can be genuine and true.
A three-way war with Islam, two sides of Islam, and the West, all involved in this game. Let me ask you, because you've mentioned it a few times, and I'm sure some of the listeners are very curious. You talk about Saudi involvement in 9/11. You talk about, you've mentioned to me before about Iranian involvement in 9/11. Could you give us any details? What was that involvement specifically?
Sure. Well, the Ayatollah Khomeini, Ruhollah Khomeini, before he died in 1989, had already conceived of an idea that he called Operation Boeing, as in Boeing airplane, which involved using airplanes as missiles to strike against the West. Now, that never came to be while he was still alive. As I said, he died in 1989. But not long afterwards, under the reign of his successor, who's still the supreme leader of Iran, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, under his rule in 1990, the government of Khartoum, Sudan, Umar al-Bashir, invited basically all the jihadis of the world. I call it a jihadi jamboree to Khartoum. And this included the Palestinians, the PLO, the PFLP, as well as the entire top levels of the Iranian government at the time, and also its terror proxy, Hezbollah. They all came to Khartoum and formed an alliance. You can read about this in the 9/11 Commission report. You can also read about this at the website I gave a bit ago, www.iran911case.com. And I have more documents from there. If anybody's interested, I'd be glad to send them. For instance, some of the affidavits from that legal case, which we call the Havlish case. Havlish was the name of one of the widows of one of the 9/11 pilots. And she and other widows of 9/11 came to a legal firm because they didn't trust the US government to get to the bottom of the 9/11 attacks, and asked the legal firm to please get on it. They paid them. The legal firm grew to a consortium of 8 legal firms by the end of the effort. I came into the effort late on. This ran from shortly after 9/11, about 2002, and I came in around 2009. Judge George Daniels, Federal District Court of New York, Southern District of New York, Manhattan, issued his ruling in December of 2011, and that's at that website I gave you, where he ruled that Iran and Hezbollah were co-responsible with Al-Qaeda for the attacks of 9/11. Now, you can read all about that relationship, those attacks, in our affidavit documents that I'd have to send you separately, and I can do that. But also there are hints of it in the 9/11 Commission report. Unfortunately, the commissioners of the 9/11 Commission were heavily pressured not to find any nation states, meaning Saudi Arabia and Iran, complicit. And so they hinted at that complicity. For example, in one of the affidavits written by our colleague Janice Kephart, she documented the placing of a mark, some kind of a mark, inside the Saudi passports of the Mosul hijackers, who were recruited in late 2000, early 2001 by Imad Mughniya, Hezbollah's longtime terror chieftain, who was permitted into Saudi Arabia to do the recruiting of those hijackers. They got themselves brand new Saudi passports, but then they weren't done traveling around and getting their training. They were crisscrossing the Iranian border for one thing. So the Saudi government and the Iranian government reached an agreement by which this mark would be placed in the passports of these hijackers to be, and the border guards would see it and not stamp the passports. Thus, at the end of everything, when they're ready to come to the United States, they could go with those Saudi passports clean and get US visas in them with no suspicions raised. And that's exactly what they did. They got the consular officials in Saudi Arabia to give them US visas because there were no alerting stamps in their passports. So that's something, that's Janice Kephardt's affidavit. Many others. The one that I co-authored with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Bruce Teft, is the one that shows the history of the Iran-Hezbollah Al-Qaeda relationship. And I can send that to anyone who's interested.
So the implication is that the elements within the Saudi government and the Iranian government colluded in helping to prepare the 9/11 hijackers for their mission.
Yes, that's exactly right. There was also, as we now know from those revealed declassified 28 pages, remember we talked about this a bit ago, of the congressional 9/11 report that took a long time getting declassified, but finally were, and as we read in there, there was a support system for the hijackers once they got to the United States as well. And that support system relied in part on Prince Bandar, the Saudi ambassador to the United States at the time, and close good friend of then President George W. Bush, who I'm not accusing him of being complicit in any way. He was not, but he was deceived, badly deceived. So that support system existed here in the United States. It existed in a network of mosques. For example, mosques at which U.S.-born but Yemeni background Anwar al-Awlaki was imam at, first one out in San Diego, then he moved east to the Dar al-Hijra Mosque in Falls Church, Virginia, as the hijackers who had, a couple at least of the hijackers who had originally come to California, moved to Virginia closer to the time of the attacks. So all of this network of support in the United States involved Saudis. It involved mosques that are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been over the years supported and funded and backed by the Saudi government. And it involved imams like Anwar al-Awlaki. So a lot of that you can glean, at least in part, from the 9/11 Commission report. More of it now in those 28 pages, which are online, and also our Havlish legal case.
It's shocking and stunning. There was something, we were in an event together earlier in May in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I learned something that I didn't know before from you. During the question and answer, you had mentioned that the Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Iran, was educated in Moscow, and so were a number of other leading Iranian government officials. Could you say anything about that? That's rather intriguing.
Sure, it opens up all kinds of questions, doesn't it? So the current supreme leader of Iran is the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and the Russians for many, many years, and they still do, invite on full scholarship students from all over the world. Third world in particular, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, to the Soviet Union, then Russia now, to get their college degrees, university degrees. And one particular place that they attended then was called the People's, I'm going to forget it here, the People's Friendship University. It was in Moscow. I'm sorry, at that time it was called Patrice Lumumba University. The name is more recently now changed to Friendship University. That's what it is. And so they got full scholarship rides there. But of course, as they were going through their studies, the KGB, the Russian, intelligence services were trolling among them. I mean, of course, and made a number of certainly contacts and certainly recruits as well. Now, I have a good friend whose name is Amir Abbas Farkabar, and he was a 1999 student uprising leader in Tehran, in Iran, for which he and many others were arrested, jailed, tortured. Amir Abbas, however, eventually managed to get out of Iran. He came to the United States somewhere around 2006 or 7, and just an amazing talent and patriot of the United States, a citizen now, but still works. and supports Iranians back in Iran who seek their liberty, in particular among students, but others. And he is now, amazingly, not only completely fluent in English, but a professor of U.S. constitutional law at Lamar University in Texas. An amazing story of a legal immigrant. So he is also married to another legal immigrant from Iran, and she became his research partner. And the two of them embarked on a project which resulted in a book that was published not so long ago, I think last year, maybe 2016, which is, in English, it's called Comrade Ayatollah. Now, it's all in Farsi, the book itself, but there is a website about it with that same name, Comrade Ayatollah, and there's English and Farsi at the website, so you can follow along if you're an English speaker only, what the book's about. And what happened is that as they're researching the book, which is all about the Russia intelligence services relationship with the top leadership of Iran, just as you said there, Amir Abbas's wife went to Moscow, went to the university, and told them she was working on a research project, and could she please have the alumni roles, the list of graduates of the university. And they said yes, and they gave it to her. And so they were able to find many names in there, as you might imagine, and this is outlined in the book. Among them, the current supreme leader of Iran, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, which goes some distance towards explaining, at least in part, the relationship between the top levels of the Iranian regime since the revolution in 1979 and the Russians.
And of course, Iran is a very close ally of Moscow now.
Well, Moscow certainly has found a client in the Tehran regime for its weapons of mass destruction included, chemical, biological, nuclear, ballistic missiles, technology, has also forged a diplomatic relationship in which Russia protects Iran from unpleasant resolutions otherwise that would have been passed in the UN Security Council and that sort of thing. And together with also often teaming up with China, protects the Iranian regime from any repercussions and helps to get things passed, like this deeply flawed Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iranian nuclear deal, completed in July 2015.
Now, you mentioned earlier, talking about nuclear weapons, you mentioned earlier in the show about Iran being on the point of deploying nuclear weapons on missiles.
Yeah, well, we've certainly seen very visibly and openly their progression in terms of ballistic missiles, short range, medium range, and long range. We know that Iran, because of its tests and because of its successes, has been able to put satellites, now maybe they're communication satellites or weather satellites, up into Earth orbit. If you have the ballistic missile capability to do that, you have the ballistic missile capability to reach intercontinental ranges. Now, they're always working on extending those ranges. The Pentagon itself openly, way back in about 2012, if I'm not mistaken, openly projected that Iran would be able to reach the continental United States from Iranian territory with a ballistic missile by the year 2015, 2 years in the past. Now, as we're speaking, the Pentagon has gone rather radio silent on that in the years since 2015. But we know that they continue to work on the missiles, so there's that. And we know from the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, which puts out That's the United Nations monitoring agency for nuclear programs around the world. It's supposed to be also kind of a clearinghouse or a sharing agency for countries that are willing to reliably, verifiably give up a nuclear weapons capability, but in return then would be able to share in nuclear technology for other purposes like power production, electricity production. So the IAEA puts out quarterly reports about Iran and its nuclear weapons program. And I would point people's attention to the one that came out in November of 2011, because it's just such a landmark report. These things are not terribly long. They're maybe like 7 or 8 pages typically. And in that one from November 2011, the IAEA outlines all of what they call the possible military dimensions, really neat little term they use, the PMDs of the Iranian program, in quite a bit of detail. And they talk about the Iranian progression to that date, remember, November 2011, with nuclear warheads, with the explosives charges to set off the initial implosion sequence of the 2 hemispheres. They talked about the milling of the 2 hemispheres from enriched uranium. They talked about all sorts of capabilities that one would need to miniaturize a nuclear warhead, et cetera, et cetera. Fascinating little read, that November 2011 Board of Governors report on the IAEA Board of Governors. Now, in the time since the 2015 JCPOA, to which the IAEA also is a party, they've become way more reticent in their quarterly reports, so you can't hardly tell what's going on anymore. And one has to expect that was part of the deal, that the IAEA would simply clam up about what it knew about Iran's progress. So these are the kinds of things that I look at. There's one more place that I would point people to, and that is a very excellent organization called the Institute for Science and International Technology, ISIS, unfortunate acronym, but it way preceded the other one, and looks like it's going to outlast it too, happily. So David Albright, who's a former IAEA inspector himself, is head of that institution, and they put out some excellent reports, which also can be very insightful when you're trying to figure out what Iran is up to with its nuclear weapons program.
So do they have the bomb now?
I think that they certainly have warheads. I think they've been testing warheads for a long time. That was apparently what was going on at Parchin, this military facility that's off limits, the place where under the JCPOA, the IAEA apparently got Iran or to allow it to come close. I don't think they got onto the property, I guess, but not really a good solid inspection overall. But then part of the agreement was that Iran would actually be allowed to take its own samples at Parchin, never mind. But even after all of that, the IAEA's inspection of the samples revealed enriched, highly enriched, weapons grade enriched uranium present at the site. So that site is certainly evidence that Iran has been working on things that it should not have under the agreement to which it remains a party, by the way. Haven't mentioned this, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It remains a signatory. It was one of the original signatories back around 1971 or 2. Check those dates to be sure, but remains a signatory under which its obligation is to report to the IAEA all of its nuclear facilities and allow inspection by the IAEA of all those facilities. Iran's not doing that, never has done that. Its nuclear weapons program was founded, again, Ayatollah Khomeini before he died in the late 1980s. It remained clandestine secret to the rest of the world, including the IAEA, for about 14 years. That is until around 2002, when the Iranian opposition group, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, blew the lid off the program with some public press conferences held in Paris and Washington, D.C. also, with satellite photographs and information about all the sites that we know now belonging to the nuclear weapons program in Iran, like Natanz, the enrichment facility, or Isfahan, the conversion facility, or Fordow, another enrichment facility. The Lavizan Shi'an, which has subsequently been razed to the ground. All of those places that we know about now, and which the IAEA counts among Iran's nuclear facilities, were revealed not by Iran in compliance with its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but by the Iranian Democratic Opposition Group, the National Council of Resistance of Iran. So after 2002, what did Iran do? Well, it did what any good totalitarian society does, and it did exactly what the Soviet Union back in the day taught it to do, which is to conceal its actual program and keep it clandestine. And I think what happened is that they moved all the important parts of the Iranian nuclear weapons program onto places like Parchin, military facilities off limits, and literally underground, under mountains and bunkers and tunnels. And the rest of the places, now revealed publicly, simply became show places. Oh, you got it back.
Hey, I'm back. Sorry about that.
It happens. It was going good until then.
Yes. Well, anyway, we're still live, so I just had one more question at the end. Who trained all these engineers? Who, the Iranian nuclear engineers and scientists, who trained them?
Well, going back many decades, actually, even before the 1979 revolution and after, Iranians often trained abroad in the West, in top European universities, in American universities, and as we've talked about, in Russian ones as well. So a lot of that education, the technical education, came from abroad, came from the West and other places. But some of the transfer of the knowledge and things like blueprints and technological knowledge came through direct transfers from other countries like Russia, like Pakistan, China, North Korea, just to name a few, as well as clandestine acquisitions, illegal acquisitions through pipelines that really run all over the world, but certainly into Western countries as well, and from time to time are discovered and shut down, but then they find, you know, some other channel through which to acquire what they're looking for.
Well, Claire, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we will be able to discuss more, because there's so much here to discuss, this issue of Iran, Islam, Saudi Arabia, 9/11. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to be with you.
All right, thank you, and thank you, viewers. I do have a slight connection problem sometimes, so thank you for sticking with us. And yeah, and join us for our next broadcast. Thank you very much.
Glad to.